I think I had a real addiction to food. I had crazy thoughts. I hated being fat. I had this roll on my tummy, Eric, that I would scrunch up in my hands and imagine cutting off. My relationship with food was a lot more involved and emotional.
I am super excited to chat with Tricia Nelson. We're going to be talking about causes and consequences of emotional eating.
There's so much gray when you're dealing with weight loss. People are like, oh, you shouldn't do mindful eating, or you should do intuitive eating, or use moderation. And all those concepts, if you've been struggling with food and weight for a long period of time, those concepts, they don't work. Overeaters are typically overdoers, so we're getting a lot done. We're on the move. Then at the end of the day, those things we didn't deal with start to percolate. They're coming to the surface. And when everybody's in bed and we're sitting there in the kitchen, we eat to basically quell our fears.
You know what? I think I might have an emotional eating problem. What would be some of the next steps that you would recommend for them to take?
Well, here's the deal.
All right, so I am super excited to chat with Tricia Nelson. We're going to be talking about causes and consequences of emotional eating. And so let's go ahead and dive into her impressive bio. Tricia Nelson lost 50 pounds by identifying and healing the underlying causes of her emotional eating. Tricia is an emotional eating expert and TEDx speaker whose talk has garnered over 2 million views on YouTube. She's the author of the #1 best-selling book, Heal Your Hunger, 7 Simple Steps to End Emotional Eating Now. Tricia is the host of the popular podcast, The Heal Your Hunger Show, and has spent over 30 years researching the hidden causes of the addictive personality. Tricia has been featured on NBC, CBS, KTLA, Fox, and Discovery Health. And welcome, Tricia.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have this conversation. Really looking forward to it. And so let's talk a little bit about your background. So seems like whenever I'm interviewing someone, we all have our own journeys and experiences which lead us to helping people in whatever niche we're serving. So how did you start helping people with emotional eating?
Yes, absolutely came from my personal experience. I was 50 pounds overweight by age 21. And I think I had a real addiction to food much earlier, obviously earlier than that, but by probably age 4 or 5, I was really excited about food. So, I like to cook. I like to eat it. I like to go out to restaurants. My whole early years were spent being pretty obsessed with food. And in adolescence, when I started to gain weight, I was pretty obsessed with my weight as well. And I hated being fat. I had this roll on my tummy, Eric, that I would scrunch up in my hands and imagine cutting off, like you cut fat off the side of a steak. And I'm like, it's just fat after all. So thankfully I didn't try that. But I had crazy thoughts like, oh, maybe I'll get some disease where I'll automatically lose weight without trying. Or perhaps I should join the army where they'll force me to exercise at boot camp because I hated to exercise. So some pretty crazy out there thoughts, which were really indicative of how out of control I felt. Like I just did not feel in control of food. I felt very obsessed with sugar and carbs specifically. I love sugar and processed carbs. And once I started, I could not stop. So it was a real roller coaster ride for me because I did diet. And then I would, I could be good for a couple weeks. I'd be like, I call it new diet syndrome, like, woo, we're doing it. And then I would fall off. Like I couldn't keep doing it after new diet syndrome wore off and I wasn't excited anymore. So I'd start 2 weeks later, I'd be crawling the walls, like I need chocolate. So it was just really painful for me how obsessed I was, how out of control I felt. And also I had a lot of shame around my body. Like I was really embarrassed about my weight. And I look back at pictures and sometimes I'm like, what was I even thinking? I wasn't even overweight at times, but I call it fat head. Like in my head, all I could see is fat. Like the technical term is body dysmorphia, but I really just couldn't see myself clearly. And I just always felt like I was fat, always felt like I had weight to lose and struggled. And so what happened for me is that my sister came home one day and she said, I'm an emotional eater. And this is way back when that was a new term. And I thought to myself, well, that's really stupid. So I just like to eat. That's what I was convinced of. I just like to eat. But then, like, you can't unhear it. And I started to observe my patterns around food, and I was horrified. I'm like, I think I'm an emotional eater, because like I would go out to lunch with friends, let's say, and I grew up in the Northeast, and they had up in Boston area, they had a store that's kind of like Denny's, but it was more of an ice cream oriented place called Friendly's. And I would go there with my friends, and they would order a sandwich, and it would come with fries, and they would eat their sandwich and pick up their fries. And I would think, why would somebody do that? Like, I was eating my fries and picking up my sandwich. And so I felt like an alien. Like, I was like, well, how do they do that? Or they'd have a hot fudge sundae, which totally dating myself here, but those tall, skinny glass jars, a hot fudge sundae, and you can see the fudge sauce and the ice cream, and there's a long metal spoon. And they would like get halfway through that hot fudge sundae, and then they'd push it aside and they'd be like, oh, I'm full. And again, I'd look at them and I'd be like, full? Like, what does that have to do with it? There's hot fudge in that container. Like, let me add it. And so I realized that I was not like other people. Like, my relationship with food was a lot more involved and emotional, because I felt like I had to have it. Like, I had to have my goodies, or my idea of a good time was getting my binge foods at the end of a long week, sitting in front of my favorite TV show and just eating. And I would never I would never imagine that I would eat as much as I would. Like, I would definitely lose control. Like, I think, I'm just going to have a bowl of ice cream, but I'd take the lid off, and the lid would never go back on. I'd eat the whole pint. So that's, how it went for me. And of course, it was hard to lose weight under those circumstances. And so even if I did lose weight for a time, I'd always put it back on. And it was very demoralizing. And it wasn't until I met somebody who helped me pivot from the diet mentality and start to really look at my relationship with food, and more importantly, look at my emotions, because I was using food for emotional reasons. And when I started to look at my emotions, start having new ways of addressing my emotions, being super aware, what was going on, then I could disconnect food from my emotional self. I could deal with my stress. I could become more balanced, and really, in so many ways, so much happier. And then from that point on, that was in my 20s, from that point on, I started working to help other people heal. And Heal Your Hunger, my company, came about 8 years ago, when I wanted to take what I did online. I wrote my book, I started my podcast, and I just, I'm so blessed to be able to help women heal their relationship with food without dieting. Literally, they can stop focusing on the food and weight, and lose weight as a byproduct of dealing with their stress, their relationship with food, and really just coming to love themselves.
That is awesome. So, it sounds like you said this happened at a really young age, and then into your 20s is when you started turning things around. So is it safe to say like a 20-year journey before you started turning things around and started helping others?
Yeah. I got help when I was 20. I was very blessed to get help, because I'd been struggling for about 7 years, and I was very blessed to get help when I was 21, and I'm 57 now. So it was actually 36 years or so later that I sit here talking to you. So I'd say I turned things around within 3 or 4 years of working with my mentor. And really my goal when I started Heal Your Hunger was to codify what he did. There was no internet then. There was no, program. It was sort of he had been morbidly obese. So he was sharing his experiences with me. And so what I did is I codified everything I learned from him. I put in my book, I quote him all the time, but I really laid out a step-by-step process for people who struggle with emotional eating to finally heal. And it's very practical, and it's very clear cut, because there's so much gray when you're dealing with weight loss. People are like, oh, you shouldn't do mindful eating, or you should do intuitive eating, or use moderation. And all those concepts, if you've been struggling with food and weight for a long period of time, those concepts, they don't work. Like they don't work. Like I was mindful that I was eating, but I would be mindful that I was eating popcorn and candy bars. Or look, I would intuit that I should eat way more than I should because my signals were off. So conventional wisdom, even beautiful wisdom that's good for a lot of people on paper, didn't work for me because I was, more in the food addicted side of things. And I have a quiz where people can find out if they're an emotional eater or a food addict. But once you've been struggling for a period of time, it does become more of an emotional eating issue. And it's really, really important that we don't just apply regular conventional wisdom to it because it may not work.
Yeah, that makes sense. So can it be challenging, at least initially, to differentiate emotional eating versus like or emotional hunger versus physiological hunger? Like you could get physiological hunger if someone has nutrient deficiencies. I mean, can you maybe differentiate the two?
Yeah, it is hard. And to tell you the truth, even to this day, sometimes I get confused because I can feel like I'm hungry, but if I do some sleuthing around it, I'm really not physically hungry, but emotional hunger can definitely mask itself as physical hunger. And it's just really important to be able to spot the clues. I mean, one of the things that's helped me the most with that is to get on a regular eating schedule that's not erratic and crazy. When those of us who struggle with food and weight, we've been on so many diets, we've done so many crazy hacks. And so we've been erratically eating, or we've been snacking all through the day, or not eating anything during the day and binging at night, having a late night binge. So we're all over the place. And for that reason, you don't know when it's physical or emotional. And so what's really helped me and what I teach my clients is something I call 3-meal magic, which is 3 meals with nothing in between. And this is so good because it's basically a surefire way, first of all, to feed yourself on a regular schedule, and it's literally you're putting 4 or 5 hours between each meal. So you're eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And even if you want to do intermittent fasting, if you just stick to like 12 or 13 hours between dinner and breakfast, I find that to be the most stabilizing. When we're going 16 hours, it's hard. It's hard and it's easy to binge once you open up your window. So, we've done so many crazy hacks with our food and weight that it's really nice to just come back to just stabilizing, super grounding, just calm way of eating. And I always tell people, think about how you would feed your kid, like your sweet baby daughter. Would you say, girlfriend, let's have you hold off on eating as long as possible because you're going to shave off a few pounds? Like, we're not going to say that to a little sweet girl, right? She's got no issues with food. But when we start saying that, it's throwing her off. It's making her feel bad if she wants to eat, if she has real hunger. And so I find that the 3 meals, it's like getting back to basics, 3 meals with nothing in between, because the snacky foods are the ones that really make us gain weight. The chips, the chocolate, a bowl of pasta, a piece of bread, buttered bread, like those are the things that, those calories add up. But if you cut out the snacky foods, you're just feeling really solid and you're also feeling sated. And that's when I can, with quite a lot of accuracy, have a conversation with myself and suss it out. Like, you think you're going to die if you don't eat right now. Is that really true? You had a good healthy breakfast, like you had good proteins, you had good fats, maybe some slow metabolizing carbs. Like at 11 o'clock, you're not starving. You might be getting a little bit hungry for lunch, but you're not starving. And you can change that insistence, right? That urgency that when it's emotional, we feel. But I can have that conversation with myself, and it's not a bad conversation to have. Right? We don't always want to believe our minds when we're telling ourselves a story like, no, I have to eat, or no, just some chocolate, just a bite of chocolate, or just one piece of chocolate. I've never had one piece of chocolate in my life. Like, I want a bar, So we have to have that conversation with ourselves. But if I'm feeding myself on a regular basis, if I've learned to care for myself, have good foods in the refrigerator, make an actual meal of real food, it's easier for me to kind of suss that out, like what's really going on, which is a great question to ask. Like, you're not really hungry for food. What are you hungry for? And you can start seeing that either you're just needing a hug, you might be needing a glass of water, or perhaps you're actually afraid of something. I was going to say craving something, but you're craving an escape from something oftentimes. Like if I'm afraid to make a phone call, like there's some hard conversation I need to have, all of a sudden I'm like, I think I'm hungry because I want to avoid it, and that's what emotional eating is we're using food for emotional reasons. We're using food to feel better or food as a distraction. And that never pays off because it's hard to stop once you start eating for non-physical reasons.
All right. Well, thanks for that explanation. So I was going to ask you about the intermittent fasting. So it sounds like if someone's, especially if they're having an issue with emotional eating, they probably don't want to do a 16-8 fast. Just stick with the 3 meals per day, 12, 13 hours fasting, fine, but you don't want to go beyond that. And I imagine it could be challenging avoiding snacks if someone has, let's say, children and there's like snacks all over the place. So I assume you have to also teach them to maybe keep them out of sight or just have some type of strategy, because that's got to be difficult as well if someone's, because again, a lot of it, that emotional part. And then if they see the snacks all the time, I mean, do you have any tips for women who have children and they have like snacks that they give their kids and they don't want to eat those snacks in between meals? If you are looking to do everything you can to save your thyroid, in addition to watching my videos on YouTube, you also might want to subscribe to my free online newsletter, which is called Healthy Gut, Healthy Thyroid. Not only will you get the latest news on how to heal your gut and restore your thyroid health, but during each edition, I'll demonstrate a different blood or functional medicine test marker that relates to healing your gut and or your thyroid. There will also be an Ask Dr. Eric section where not only can you see questions that other people have asked related to gut and thyroid health, but you can also submit a question for me to answer in a future edition. To subscribe to the Healthy Gut, Healthy Thyroid newsletter, please visit savemythyroid.com/newsletter.
Absolutely. And it is important that we up-level our kids' snacks, right? Like at holiday time, Whole Foods has different version of Halloween candy than the regular supermarkets do. Like we could up-level our snacking, right? Like snack foods that are in the house. But it is, out of sight, out of mind, it does help. If somebody has a spouse that's a junk food eater or kids that love junk food, I find just having a cabinet where it's in the cabinet, that's their cabinet, and but at least you're not staring at it, because it is harder. It's just harder if you're staring at a bag of Doritos when you come home from work and you're stressed out. So putting that, behind closed doors is a good idea. But on the topic of stress, it's also really important that we have a way to deal with stress at the end of the day. Most emotional eaters do most of their emotional eating after about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So end of day into the evening or even at night. And my experience is that's for a few reasons. One reason is that's after accumulation of stress throughout the day, and we're, overeaters are typically overdoers. So we're getting a lot done. We're on the move. We're crossing things off our list, and it's very satisfying. We get a dopamine hit from that. But if we're not taking time to eat proper meals, again, really important to feed ourselves in a healthy way and make sure we eat. But the other thing that's really important is that when we're on the move like that, we're not typically addressing how we're feeling about things. We're just, moving. And then at the end of the day, those things we didn't deal with start to percolate. They're coming to the surface. And we're like, I can't believe such and such happened. I can't believe I got that letter, or wow, that conversation didn't go well. I feel bad about how I reacted. Like all the troubles from the day that we were moving too fast to address come to the surface, or even just the worries. The worries start to come to the surface. And when everybody's in bed and we're sitting there in the kitchen fretting, we eat. We eat to basically quell our fears. And so it's just really important for people to have a way to address those emotions, to process stress, and also to not do as much. And we are overdoers. It does get us into trouble. As you know, people exhaust their adrenals, they're depleted, they're not getting enough sleep, their hormones are imbalanced. And so that leads to overeating all the time because we eat to feel better. And when our energy's low or we're not getting enough rest, plus we have that racing mind, and overeaters are also overthinkers. So we're tearing stuff apart. Like we are just like tearing it to shreds, overthinking it. And again, all these things lead to overeating. And so it's just really important that we have a way to throw off that stress. And maybe even, God forbid, we make changes in our schedule so we're not overdoing. We're not saying yes to everybody. We've got boundaries on our time. This superwoman syndrome it runs deep for emotional eaters because we get so much of our validation from people saying, oh, you're amazing, like atta girl, right? And, give it to Tricia. She'll do the extra project. She's amazing. And I just love to hear that. Meanwhile, I'm resentful because everybody's giving me their work. Nobody's doing their part. And I always say it's the perfect storm for a binge is to be overworked, underpaid, and then stressed out, tired, and resentful. And then we're like, screw them. I'm going to reward. Because also when we people please, nobody's ever as pleased as we think they're going to be. So we take on the extra work thinking about all the praise we're going to get. People barely notice. They get used to it. Like, give it to her. She'll do it. Right. And we're barely noticed. So we're even more resentful and feeling like it didn't pay off. So we reward ourselves with the I deserve it binge.
So stress is huge for a lot of different conditions. And yeah, I mean, it makes sense with emotional eating as well. So you want to try your best to reduce the stressors, but a lot of times it comes down to increasing your stress management, your stress handling skills. And you mentioned also sleep importance when it comes to emotional eating, because that obviously if you don't get enough sleep, that'll also affect your adrenals as well. So you educate your clients, I'm sure, at least 7-8 hours sleep per night?
Yeah. I mean, we don't address the sleep as much as we address the overdoing and the overcommitting. Yeah. That's really the cause, right? And if somebody doesn't start looking at how they're living, it's going to be hard to address how they're eating and how they're sleeping, because it's hard to sleep when you're stressed out. And it's hard not to be stressed out when you're doing too much and you're trying to please everybody. So I really do love to say it's a living problem, not an eating problem, and that's what we're missing a lot of times. We're always say, doc, give me the diet. Tell me what to eat, doc, right? But not tell me how to make changes in how I live, doc, right? Like we don't do that conversation. We don't have that conversation. And it's so vital. Because in my book, I talk about the anatomy of the emotional eater. And these are 24 personality traits that make up the emotional eater's personality. And these traits have nothing to do with food. They're people pleasing. They're not like speaking up for ourselves, having a racing mind, caretaking. We love to find a project. We love to find somebody who needs our help and then knock ourselves out trying to help them, doing for them what they could be doing for themselves. Because again, it feeds us in some way to be needed and to be important. But this is what leads to overeating, is when we're overcommitted and we're overgiving. And so these are some of the living things that need to change. Otherwise, nothing will change.
And you mentioned when you were dealing with problems with emotional eating that sugar and carbs were two of the biggies. And I imagine I know that's the case with a lot of people, because I also work with a lot of people that have the sugar cravings. And so even in that situation, it still ties into those like 24 personality traits when someone has sugar and carb cravings.
Well, here's the deal. We're not binging on salads. Like we're binging on the foods that give us the hit, where they're feeding the reward centers in our brain, but they're also the foods that put a blanket on our emotions. Like we're numbing with food. We're using food to numb our feelings. And when I say emotional eating, and I talk about numbing our emotions, I like to give people what I call the PEP formula. And PEP, PEP is an acronym which helps explain what those emotions are. Because there's lots of emotions out there, and we can't chase each one down trying to fix it. But to understand kind of what the umbrella ones are and how food is being used specifically for a coding of those emotions, for escaping those emotions, is really, really important. So the PEP formula is, we know what food does to us, but it's really an explanation for what food is doing for us. And so the first P stands for painkiller. And we're literally using food to anesthetize pain, like just kill my pain so I don't feel so much. And it works. But again, it's the sugar and carbs, okay? Like that's what we're using. That's where we're going to, because it's heavy, it's high calorie. It certainly, gives us a hit, serotonin and dopamine hit. And basically it works. It works. We don't feel bad once we start eating chips and chocolate. We'll feel bad later, but not immediately, right? It'll coat our emotions first. It'll kill our pain. And when I say pain, it could be anything uncomfortable. Like it could be getting some bad news. Like we just go right to the refrigerator. Or it could be having a bad day at work. It could be a relationship struggle. Any of these things cause painful emotions, and we use food to cover up that pain, to bury that pain. The E in PEP stands for escape. And again, sugar and carbs are a great escape. And so we get our sugar and carbs, we sit in front of the TV and we're like, I don't want to think about anything. And one of the reasons is because we're scaring ourselves half to death most of the time. Like I call it awfulizing. We get on that track of thinking about worst case scenarios. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if I'm a bag lady and homeless? What if the relationship doesn't work out? We're always thinking about worst case scenarios, and we scare ourselves half to death. And then we want to literally just escape our own brains. Like hanging out with our brains is exhausting. So when we're eating, we're in escape mode. And for moments, we're feeling fine. We're feeling fine. And so that's another reason why food really serves us, especially sugar and carbs. And the last reason, last P in PEP, stands for punishment, which seems a little counterintuitive because we use food as a reward, right? Like we're eating to reward ourselves. But if you think about it on the back end, when we feel terrible, or when we're full, when we feel like we've eaten too much and we're like, oh my God, why did I do that? That's hardly a reward. And we do it time and time again. We stuff ourselves time and time again and feel sick. So it begs the question, like, why would I do that? And my experience is, as overeaters, we're also overfeelers, and we feel guilty very easily. So we just are beating the crap out of ourselves all the time. And food's a good way to do it. First, we're trying to escape those feelings, but then we end up beating up our bodies, feeling sick, and it's self-inflicted. And my experience is there's a built-in punishment in the way that we eat, especially when we have health issues. And our doctor has said, stay away from sugar, stay away from sugar and processed foods. And that's the very thing we go to. And so, sure enough, we feel like crap in no time.
All right. I like that. The PEP formula. And so for those who are listening to this and they're thinking, you know what, I think I might have an emotional eating problem. What would be some of the next steps that you would recommend for them to take? Obviously, listen to your podcast, read your book are some good initial steps to take, but anything else?
Yeah, I would recommend starting with a quiz on my website, and you can find my book and my TEDx talk and my podcast on my website as well. It's healyourhunger.com. But there is a quiz front and center there, which when you take that, it's like a 3-minute free quiz. But when you take it, you'll find out if you're an emotional eater or a food addict or somewhere in between. And it's really good information. And based on your personalized score, you'll be taken through a journey of, a video you can watch and some next steps. But it's based on your, taking the quiz and your personalized score. So I highly recommend taking that quiz and get started and when I say where are you on the spectrum, I'm talking about what I call the emotional eating spectrum, where emotional eating is something we all can do, right? Like everybody's on the spectrum. We can all lose control now and then, or just say, screw it, eat the whole bag. But for those who take it way too far, for those who are really suffering with this, and it's been a decades-long struggle, you're going to be on the higher end of that. And that's when you enter the addiction phase, the food addiction phase, where it is seriously compromising your health. You're doing it in spite of doctors' warnings, right? You know better. You may even be a health coach or a doctor, and you're thinking, oh my God, I'm such a fraud, right? Because I know better and I'm teaching people how to eat and I'm not even following my own advice. So that's really when, and I often say to people, where you are in that spectrum is qualified by the level of control you have. Like, can you scale back? Can you say, okay, enough already. I'm not eating sugar from now on. Or do you just, once you start eating, you keep going? You keep going, you can't course correct. That's someone who can't course correct is someone with not very much control. And the other thing that qualifies where you are on that spectrum are the level of consequences. Have you been eating this way for a few decades? Is it catching up to you? Are you pre-diabetic now? Have you ruined your gut microbiome because of the crappy foods that you're eating? And we have to take a look at that is chronic thing, like the chronic habit that we've had for a long, long time. And there's steps we need to take based on that. But when you take that quiz, that's where you'll find out where you are in that spectrum.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned some of the consequences because it's not just about weight gain. I mean, you mentioned diabetes, you mentioned how it could disrupt the gut microbiome. I mean, all these are really important. And I will say, I don't think I'm an emotional eater, but I took your quiz. I was like, you know what, I'm gonna be interviewing Tricia. Let me take your quiz. And her quiz is real. It's comprehensive, but it's easy. And what I mean by that, it's not just like a 4 or 5 question quiz. It's a good amount of questions, but it's pretty easy, like yes, no questions, but really comprehensive. So yeah, I highly recommend taking Tricia's quiz, and we'll of course include that in the show notes. And before wrapping up, anything else? Is there anything else that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you, or anything else that you'd like to say, Tricia?
Well, I'll just mention that if people are interested in getting help, we do offer a complimentary breakthrough session where somebody can speak with one of our mentors and find out, what it takes and what my programs are like. And the other thing is I do some cool events. Like I do a quit sugar challenge a few times a year where I will, for 5 days, teach people literally the mechanics of quitting sugar, because there's a process. And this is something that changed my life when I learned this information. That's why I teach it. Literally how to read labels, how to learn the 80 plus names for sugar, how to detox from sugar in a safe, relatively easy way. You might have a headache, but you can get through that after day 4. So it's a 5-day challenge. It also addresses emotional eating as well, like our emotional connection to sugar. Because when people hear, quit sugar, oftentimes they panic and they're like, I can't live without sugar. Like sugar's my best friend. Well, that's called an emotional relationship with sugar. And I address that as well, because that was me. I mean, sugar was my best friend for all intents and purposes. And so point is, we have some really cool events that can serve people as well.
Wonderful. Yeah. So if they get on your email list, they'll get alerted when you have those events. You said you have a few times a year, the live events.
Yeah.
And yeah, wonderful. So yeah, definitely check out Tricia's quiz, her book, her TEDx talk, a lot of resources, your podcast. Again, go through that breakthrough session or apply for the breakthrough session. We'll include all these links in the show notes. And thank you. Thank you so much for having this conversation. Again, a lot of people have this problem, and unfortunately, a lot of people don't realize it's a problem, but hopefully this conversation will make people more aware of this. And appreciate you taking the time to educate my audience about emotional eating, Tricia.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be here. And I'm looking forward to having you on my show.
Yeah, look forward to that as well. And thank you. And yeah, we'll definitely be chatting again soon.